Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Maryland Public Service Commission. We are hearing an ad hoc item. Today it's a filing from New Frontiers Telecommunications. We also have with us Verizon Maryland LLC and the Commission staff. So what we're going to do is we'll first hear from New Frontiers Telecommunications, then Verizon, then Commission staff. I want to limit each party to 10 minutes for their presentation, and then we'll have time for questions from commissioners. This hearing is on the disconnection of trunking issue. It is not on the merits of case number 9452, and so I will ask all the parties to restrict your comments to the disconnecting of trunks and the motion by New Frontiers, and not on the broader case itself. So with that, let's turn first to New Frontiers Telecommunications.
Hello. Thanks, Chairman and Commission. My name is Clint Wiley. I'm the owner and president of New Frontiers Telecommunications. We're a CLEC in business in Hagerstown, Maryland, and we serve primarily Western Maryland. The reason we're here today is because Verizon has disconnected trunks that are necessary for both intrastate and, in some cases, local traffic into and out of our network. Verizon chose to disconnect those circuits in spite of the fact that there's an ongoing case with a proposed order and an appeal. They made this decision without notice and without any prior opportunity, time as required in their tariff. These trunks were originally ordered in 1999 in a way that they would handle traffic that would be intra and interstate traffic, primarily traffic to and from long-distance carriers, IXC traffic. Over time, the nature of the traffic has changed to the point where the traffic not only handles IXC traffic as described, but also traffic with other CLECs and carriers, including local traffic. Also handles, in some cases, traffic for cellular traffic, voice traffic. As a result of this, we have customers who are unable to make or receive local calls, primarily receive local calls, as well as intrastate calls within the state of Maryland. So, for example, staff could not call me the other day.
Excuse me, Mr. Wiley, would you mind pulling your microphone a little bit closer to you?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
A little bit better. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Is that better? Okay. The disconnection has caused, as you can imagine, a number of our customers to it's created a havoc for customers. They're not able to receive calls, both from anywhere outside of Maryland, but also from most parts of Maryland, and including local calls. We've got business customers who only advertise a toll-free number, and they can't receive calls on those numbers, whether they're from across the street or across the country. We've got a couple of complaints that have indicated that we have one that said that there was an emergency call from a family member in California, and that call obviously failed. We have a customer, a company called, or an organization called DefNet, which provides services to hearing impaired, hundreds if not thousands of hearing impaired clients throughout Western Maryland, and they labeled this issue as a life or death situation. They are not able to perform the necessary functions necessary to provide the services that they do. Verizon believes that they have the right to disconnect these without notice because these circuits have been de-tariffed in Maryland. That is a dangerous precedent. To be able to just disconnect a circuit without any kind of warning, any kind of notice, is a dangerous precedent to competition in the state of Maryland. But truly, the most important thing right now are the local the local users in Western Maryland that use our service. They are floundering without having the ability to receive calls, whether they be local, intrastate, or interstate calls. And we have a case pending before this commission with an appeal. We think that this was not a prudent time for this. We would think that until there was an order, that any of this kind of action would have been stayed, as was the original recommendation in that. So it is within the commission's power to order that these be turned back on, pending the final order and the outcome of the appeal. And that's what we're here to ask you to do today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wiley. Let me ask you, you mentioned some of your customers are not able to receive local calls as a result of Verizon terminating feature group D trunks.
Right.
Are they these customers you're referring to, are they receiving some local calls, or are they receiving no local calls?
They are receiving some local calls, and it seems that we've had a very relatively short period of time to try to delve into what the traffic patterns are, and as you can imagine, we've just been deluged with calls and complaints. So it's been difficult for us to spend a lot of time looking into this. But what it looks like is that in many cases the calls are CLEC to CLEC calls. So let's say somebody has Windstream. Windstream would send that local call through the feature group D trunks. Those are no longer completing. We have miscellaneous cell phone complaints that Sprint in particular calls aren't completing. So a Sprint customer might not be able to call a New Frontiers customer, and all toll-free traffic seems to be. And I know that's not necessarily local, but we have some customers that only advertise, business customers that only advertise their toll-free number, so they expect local callers to be able to call them on that. But we had one or two random complaints that said that they might not be able to receive a Verizon call, but I'm not sure that would be the case, because typically they would, and Susan will probably agree with this, that those calls at the very least should traverse our local trunking. But but it looks like some carrier local calls are not completing. So CLEC to CLEC, carrier local calls are not completing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Any additional questions? We'll start with Commissioner O'Donnell.
I think you referenced a California call back
Correct.
to here where it was a family emergency and they couldn't get through. The call didn't get through. That's concerning, obviously, if that occurred. But in your company's written filing, it says the commission has de-tariffed interchange services provided by CLECs. However, the commission does maintain jurisdiction over the delivery of access services supporting long-distance calls. Do we have jurisdiction over the access services supporting that long-distance call from California?
I believe you do, in terms of the fact that these trunks are established here in Maryland. Even though you may have de-tariffed that, you have that jurisdiction.
And that would be similarly true if a call was going long distance out?
Our outbound trunks, it would be similarly true. We use a different carrier. We use a carrier for outbound long distance, because at the time that wasn't something we would have purchased from Verizon. I don't think they were even able to offer on a retail basis, provide long distance that far ago. So outbound long distance calls are completing. It's inbound calls that have been completely disabled.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Wiley before we... All right, hearing none, let's go to Verizon next.
Right. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Susan Paiva on behalf of Verizon. Can you hear me all right with the mic? All right. So I am sorry that this came to this for these end users. This is not the way we wanted it to go. But I don't believe this is a case of Verizon taking some hasty or precipitous action. This, unfortunately, is a case of New Frontiers not responsibly operating its business, holding itself out to these customers that it's going to provide this calling service, but it is not paying the wholesale provider for its facilities. So the trunks at issue are being used but are not being paid for. So obviously we've had this case pending before the Commission since 2017. I think it might be helpful to explain to you first, what we disconnected and what's still running quickly. So they lease from Verizon facilities that would connect directly to these customers and take their calls to New Frontiers. None of that is involved here. We did not alter any of that. What's at issue here is sort of like a back office trunking kind of arrangement. So there are two sorts of trunking arrangements that they can lease from Verizon that basically would carry traffic from New Frontier switch out to the world, to the public switched network. One category are local trunks, and those are designed to carry local traffic. And I guess all of this is a relic back to the day when local and long distance was a very significant difference in regulation and in the different companies that offered it. So the networks are still traditionally set up that way. So the CLEC's local traffic would go over those local trunks. And then they also have the option to order from Verizon trunks that would carry their long distance traffic to and from interexchange carriers. For long distance intrastate and interstate long distance calls. So we did not disconnect the local trunks, and we've in fact gone back and tested them 3 or 4 times just to make sure they're still working, and the local trunks are working just the same as they did before we took this action. But we did disconnect the feature group D trunks that carry the traffic between New Frontiers and the interexchange carriers. Now you might ask, why did we do that now? We have been patiently, we've disconnected some things that were totally non-jurisdictional, but we did not disconnect, bless you, these services because they were tied into providing the ultimate service to these customers that are receiving regulated local service. So we didn't disrupt those customers. But as the case has gone along, we had the hearings. At the February 14th hearing, there was testimony on the record that made clear 2 things. One, that there actually are these separate trunks dedicated to IXC traffic. And the second thing, that the Commission does not have jurisdiction over interexchange traffic. That fact comes from a change in the law in 2015. I believe it was House Bill 472, changed the definition of the telephone company, the telephone service over which the Commission has regulatory jurisdiction. So at that time it was limited to local service and a few other things, but interexchange service was removed. So back in 2015, then the Commission issued a notice basically telling everyone you have to de-tariff those interexchange services because we no longer have jurisdiction. So in our estimation, even though we didn't want it to come to this, the case is proceeding in a manner where we don't believe New Frontiers intends to pay us. We believe they intend to try to prolong it, and according to their memorandum that they filed recently, to even take appeals, petitions for rehearing, and that we would be required to keep at least the local service in place without being paid during all of that. So we're thinking we need to really disconnect anything that the Commission doesn't have jurisdiction over and just leave at the core of the case the items that the Commission has jurisdiction over. So that is why we disconnected these trunks, because the Commission doesn't have jurisdiction over the interexchange service that the customers are receiving, the end user service, and the trunks themselves are ordered out of the FCC tariff, so they're not really jurisdictional on that end of the facility being purchased either. As to the notice, this case started out with a notice of disconnection. We've given multiple notices of disconnection. I don't think there's any secret that we intended to disconnect services if we're not being paid. And on the question of the traffic, what kind of traffic today is actually going over those trunks, we don't control what other carriers do with the routing of their traffic. So if someone some wireless carrier is sending local traffic over the wrong trunks. I mean, that, we didn't do that. We didn't set that up. But what I can say is that the local trunks, the local trunk groups remain functional. We've tested them, they're working. And so if there's a need for anybody to reroute their local traffic over those trunks, I mean, they would still flow. And the inter-exchange trunks would not be used. That may just be a matter of having to contact some of these carriers to make sure they route their traffic correctly.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Payette?
I just, from what you just told us, so you say it is possible that based on the action Verizon took, you could be impacting the local service.
You know, it should not happen because
Well, it
those
should not,
trunks
but
are
could
dedicated.
Could it be happening?
So if, like, well, we can use Sprint for an example
Okay,
because,
can you just answer the question first? Could it be happening that what the action Verizon took is impacting the local service?
it could happen if someone is routing their traffic incorrectly, but they could reroute it onto the
Who
correct
would be
trunks.
contacting these other providers to make sure that they're routing correctly?
well,
Which
it'd
is
have
a
to
whole
be-
different question. I don't know what.
Well, it would have to be New Frontiers because it would be the traffic between New Frontiers and
Did
this
you
third
know?
party.
But you didn't notify New Frontiers, did you? So they could contact to make sure everything was being routed correctly.
Well, we notified them at the beginning of the case, but also I think
Oh.
it may be an issue that you couldn't tell beforehand. You know, you wouldn't know that somebody's routing it over the wrong trunk until the trunk was disconnected
I
and
think
the
you answered
traffic
the
failed.
question. So what you did potentially did disrupt the service.
That was not our
And
intent.
at this point, nobody, to your knowledge, has contacted these other providers to route correctly, as you put it.
Well, Verizon hasn't contacted them.
Okay, you just, on your own, disconnected.
We
Without
disconnected
notice.
with New Frontiers.
Okay.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Lind?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Ms. Piva, you said earlier that Verizon had some concern that New Frontiers was, through the appeal process, potentially dragging the case out or going to a point where they're just trying to get more time. Was that a concern that the company had?
Yes, and I think we have articulated that concern in filings with the commission.
Okay, so, I mean, certainly you're familiar with the administrative process that the commission uses. So while it may appear as though the company is attempting to drag it out, they do have the administrative right to file an appeal. So would you agree that that is the case?
They have the right to appeal. I think it's within the commission's discretion whether we are ordered not to disconnect the service while the administrative process plays out.
Okay. So the timing that the company took then wasn't necessarily because of the appeal itself, but because of the concern that by dragging it out, they're not financially paying?
Right, that they're continuing to accrue more debt to us that they're not paying, and the time to end it would be indefinite.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else? Commissioner O'Donnell?
I'm sorry. Ms. Pivot, could you comment on whether or not you also believe the commission maintains jurisdiction over the delivery of access services supporting long-distance calls?
Well, the commission does maintain jurisdiction over intrastate access, so the delivery of intrastate long-distance calls, but access is not what's at issue here. Access would be, as like with regard to Verizon, if a customer of another carrier called a Verizon customer, then we provide access so that that call can be made, and then we charge the carrier the traditional switched access rates that you may have heard of for their company to call us. So that's something different.
So we don't maintain jurisdiction over the access services to long-distance calls between New Frontier and Verizon?
Well, you maintain jurisdiction over the rates that we charge if a New Frontier's customer placed a long-distance call to a Verizon customer.
Right.
But that's
So
not
we
the
do
same as the
main-
facilities.
Well, we do maintain jurisdiction, but didn't your disconnections affect that local access service to long-distance calls?
Well, they affected the facility that carries the traffic, the long-distance
Yeah.
traffic to
I'm not
IXCs.
trying to parse words with you.
And I guess it also might be a little bit confusing because Verizon is a big company with many different parts. The only party to this case is Verizon Maryland, which is the local carrier. So most of our traffic is local. I mean, the IXCs would be, back in the day, MCI, AT&T, the ones that carry the long-distance calls. So those are the ones who would be mostly paying us switched access to terminate those calls, and those are also the ones that would be exchanging traffic with New Frontiers over these trunks. I hope that makes sense.
Did I understand you to say that the reason you took this, Verizon took this action now was because you didn't like the way the case was proceeding on appeal, and that you felt it might be time to take such action?
Well, it's more that the way the timing worked, right? We had the hearing, Judge Romine said she was going to issue an order quickly, so we waited to see what that order was, and then she set the date of May 1st that New Frontiers might decide to enter into a payment arrangement, or they might appeal. So we waited for that date to pass, and then basically based on the contents of their brief, they said they didn't really intend to pay us, and they intended to pursue, petitions for rehearing, appeals to court. So that gave us concern that the case was not going to get resolved based on the activities at the hearing and before the judge.
Right, but wouldn't you agree with Commissioner Linton that they have the right to take such administrative procedures? It's a matter of due process available to everybody in these cases. They have the right to do that.
I agree they have the right to do that, but I
You might not
don't
like
agree that they have the right to have the termination stayed, especially of non-jurisdictional services.
it. Thank you.
Anything else, Art? Not. Let's hear from Commission staff. Ms.
Is- an opportunity for-
what I'll do is we're going to hear from Commission staff, and then Mr. Wiley, I'll give you a brief moment to respond.
Good morning, Your Honor. Annette Garofalo.
Can you pull your mic a little?
Oh,
down?
sure.
Just a little-
Annette Garofalo and Lloyd Spivak on behalf of Commission staff. You correctly state that the status of the case really doesn't impact the issue before us, so I'm going to just turn this over to Mr. Alvarado and Ms. Ward because they are able to answer the rather technical nature of what's going on here in a way that I couldn't begin to give justice to.
Okay.
All right. Good afternoon. So at the outset, I want to say that obviously this has been last minute, so we haven't been able to issue any discovery. There's no testimony or evidence as to what went on when this was turned off. So I think from the questions that I've heard, one of the things that I want to clarify is that I am certain that this is not switched access. This is not. This is a wholesale service, but this is not Verizon providing New Frontiers the ability to terminate calls to the Verizon network. What this is that New Frontiers leases a trunk, kind of like just a cable, and that they can then use to exchange their traffic with every other telecommunications company in the country. So in that regard, it's almost like leasing a car, right? Like you're just like, here's your car, and then you work with your car, but we have nothing else to do except that you're leasing from us, so you have to pay us for the use of that. There are two types of trunks, as Verizon said. There's the local and the inter-exchange now. Of course, Verizon, once you give them the car, they don't know what New Frontiers does with that car. They might say, like, well, you're only able to drive this within the state of Maryland, but then New Frontiers might drive it outside of the state, and they wouldn't really know. So in the traditional sense, what would happen is New Frontiers would have to route all of its local traffic through the local trunk, all of its inter-exchange traffic through the inter-exchange trunk. As Mr. Wiley pointed out, those boundaries have been kind of fuzzed over the years. And so what could have happened, and again, I'm not saying that this is what happened, but what could be happening is that because they didn't buy enough capacity at the local level, by they I mean New Frontiers, that they decided that because they have capacity on the long-distance trunk, they can route traffic through the local traffic through the long-distance trunk. And if that's the case and the long-distance trunk is switched off, now they don't have capacity in the local trunk to carry all the local traffic. What that's going to result in is problems at the local level, because and that mainly stems from the fact that there is not enough capacity at the local level to carry the local traffic as it should have been. So it is very difficult for me at this point, without evidence and without discovery, to determine what is true here. Whether it is that there is not enough local capacity for all these calls to be routed, or whether in fact, this is some kind of weird, hybrid trunk that is also delivering and should be delivering local traffic. What I can say is that featured Group D trunks since 1996 were not designed to carry local traffic, and they shouldn't have been carrying local traffic to begin with. To the extent that they were, and that those calls that are being carried over that are being dropped, that is an issue that New Frontiers has to deal with because it is their leased trunk. It is not Verizon's anymore since they leased it from Verizon. As to the issue of the customer from California calling into a New Frontiers customer, again, that is access between whoever the calling party was using, whether it be Sprint or it be some mobile phone or some local exchange company out in California, and New Frontiers, who has to provide access for that call. Again, Verizon is not in the middle of that transaction at all, pursuant to the network or to their interconnection agreement. And there is no switched access that Verizon has to provide at that point. I guess I can answer any questions that you might have at the technical level, but not really knowing more about this, I really think it's easier for me to just answer any questions that you may have.
Okay. Start with Commissioner Herman.
Thank you, Mr. Alvarado. Which entity assigns the traffic to the trunk? Which entity assigns local traffic to the local trunk or potentially to the long-distance trunk?
In this case, it would be New Frontiers.
So New Frontiers controls whether traffic is traveling, whether to direct traffic to the local trunk or the long-distance trunk.
New Frontiers controls the routing in their own trunks, and this is, for all intents and purposes, their own trunks. Now, of course, and here's where it gets fuzzy, if you make a cell phone call from like outside this room into this room, you would say that's a local call, except that it's not, because it's a cell phone. Mm-hmm. And cell phone by definition is an inter-exchange call. So similarly with toll-free numbers, you can make a toll-free call into, presumably, let's assume that there's a toll-free number here. You can make a call from right there into the toll-free number. That, from your perspective, would be a local call because you're calling from outside the room, but in reality it's an inter-exchange call because the way it's routed, it would have to go out to some database that is going to look up the number, and then it's going to be able to route it back here. So the FCC has determined a long time ago that these are all inter-exchange calls. So the geographic location of a call is no longer a good enough indication of whether the call is local or not. It has to do with the type of call that you're making.
Okay, but what I'm getting at is if I'm a small business and I sign up with New Frontier, then New Frontier takes some action that assigns my local service to trunk A and my long distance service to trunk B. Is that correct?
That's the way it should be, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Linton.
Yes. I actually had a question for staff counsel, not for Mr. Alvarado.
Sure.
Here she is.
Okay. I was wondering if what your thoughts were on the actions that the company took during the course of the appeal process, and what do you think that does for the posture of the parties during the process that's occurring before the commission?
Well, the company timely filed a notice of appeal.
I'm sorry, the company, New Frontiers.
New Frontiers
Okay.
timely filed a notice of appeal, and then within the time frame allowed by law, they filed a memo in support of their appeal. And so the effect of that is to suspend the Public Utility Law Judge's order until there's an answer to the appeal. But I did not see anything untoward in those actions.
Sorry, you mean the actions of the appeal or the act?
The actions of New Frontiers in filing an appeal, I mean, that's their right to file an appeal.
Did you notice that there was a request for an expedited review or additional relief or anything of that sort filed by either party during the course of the appeal?
I did not see that. Staff did not file such a request, and I don't think Verizon filed such a request.
No, we have not filed
Yeah.
anything yet in the appeal.
Okay. Oh, so you haven't filed a response to the memorandum on
No,
appeal?
it's due next week.
Due next week. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Ms. Garofalo, so in staff's counsel's view, does the commission have jurisdiction over Verizon's decision to disconnect the feature Group D trunks?
Well, so that's what I was. The commission has jurisdiction over certain items which are considered to be intrastate and not interstate.
Correct.
And so some of those items are detariffed, but you still hold jurisdiction over those. And that's the part that I need the brain trust for, because and we put that into the record so that the public utility law judge would be clear on that. And so if the question is do I think this particular disconnection was legal, I think it would depend on where the lines were purchased from, what tariff they were purchased under, and whether they provide interstate service, which, as Mr. Alvarado pointed out, they might provide such service. It may appear to be intrastate, it could be within this building, but if it's on a cell phone, it would be defined as interstate service. It's my understanding, but we may not. It's always possible that the facts are not completely correct, because, as he pointed out, we have not done any discovery on this. That these were purchased under the federal tariff, which would mean they are considered interstate lines whose purpose is for interstate service, and where the notice of termination requirements would be governed by the Federal Communications Commission.
Thank you.
And can I add just one real quick thing? The local trunks are in Verizon's Maryland tariffs. The feature D group trunks are not. That's a fact. So that might differentiate to you where, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to make a legal argument here, but that might differentiate to you where your jurisdiction starts and ends. The first thing I did, literally the first thing I did when I got New Frontiers' letter, was to call Verizon to make sure that none of the local trucks had been terminated or turned off. That was the key to me. As long as you don't terminate the local trunks, that to me is critical. Verizon indicated to me that they hadn't. So to the extent that helps you.
Oh, thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Yeah, so it's not clear to me whether or not we have jurisdiction over this or not. But what I do think we have jurisdiction over is the local telephone service that affects the public safety of the citizens of Maryland. And I think what we're hearing is that people who are, for instance, deaf and hard of hearing are not getting local telephone service. Now, that may not have been intended by the action taken to prod a court case or to prod a settlement or whatever it was done for, but because Verizon was displeased with the progress of the case on appeal. But it certainly impacts potentially the public safety of the citizens of Maryland. Can staff counsel advise us as to whether or not we have jurisdiction on that basis alone to take action here?
Well, I think there's no question that 911 service is still available.
Yeah, but I don't know. Right.
But you're asking about the
The new-
interstate calls that did not go through?
No, I'm asking about the testimony, the assertion from New Frontiers that Maryland citizens who are deaf and hard of hearing are not receiving their local telephone service as a result of this action, and that that association termed a severe threat to their safety. And I'm not talking about interstate, I'm talking about intrastate.
This is an unusual circumstance, so you could perhaps take that action, although I think Mr. Alvarado would maybe lend you some guidance on just the technical side.
I might. So the first thing is you definitely have jurisdiction over those local calls. The question in my mind is who is responsible for not being able to terminate those calls? Again, without discovery, I don't want to cast any assertions over one party or the other, but it could be that New Frontiers did everything correctly, and somehow, because of the way Verizon was doing their management by terminating an inter-exchange switch, that affected the local calls. It could also be that New Frontiers should have purchased more local trunking capability, but instead of doing that, decided to go around it by going through the inter-exchange switch. And it is that action that New Frontiers took that is affecting the local call. And so, again, it's very difficult because there's no evidence and there's no opportunity to discovery. But if it comes to the commission to decide whether it is New Frontiers' actions that caused this problem or whether it's Verizon's, I have an opinion. You might have your own. But that's, I think, where we are. I 100% agree with you. You have jurisdiction over those local calls, and you should be able to take action on those, on ensuring that those calls are terminated. But the question right now is whose actions were at fault for not being able to terminate those calls? Was it Verizon's or was it New Frontiers?
Right, so you present to the commission a decision that forces us to choose between the interest of Verizon or the interest of New Frontiers. And I think where my mind is, I can't determine that from this vantage point, nor do I understand the underlying case on appeal. But I do have an overriding interest that are neither of those two companies, which is the public interest of and the safety of the citizens of the state. And that's what I'm concerned about, regardless of what these two companies are fighting about.
Anything else for staff?
Yeah,
Commissioner Richard, then Commissioner Linton.
Just for Mr. Alvarado, so if I'm understanding your explanation of how the technology works, it is possible for New Horizon to go back and ensure that they're routing all the calls correctly through the local trunk, and therefore all these problems should go away. Is that what
That is absolutely correct.
Okay.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
If they don't have enough capacity on those local trunks, then it is their responsibility to purchase more capacity to be able to route those calls.
Okay, so there still could be an impact from what Verizon did, going to specifically to the concerns
Well,
I share with Commissioner O'Donnell. But again, a question we could then ask the New Horizons, have they ensured that all calls are being routed correctly, and do you have capacity? Then that should resolve any problem.
New Frontier should be able to route all the calls correctly.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, I want to ask you, are there any notification requirements for Verizon to take the action they did to the federal authorities, FCC, that would be publicly, available and knowable?
There are. We would have to find out what those are. We would have to present those to you at a later date, maybe.
Okay, so at this point
We could do it
don't know.
today, but we couldn't do it right now.
We don't know if Verizon acted correctly with federal authorities at this point.
No, this arose very quickly, and we actually don't. There are many factual issues that we don't have certainty about.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Linton?
I'm looking at this as an emergency motion proceeding, where we're not able to take evidence at this point. I think all the parties have acknowledged that there's still some questions about who's responsible for what, and we don't know necessarily why this problem was created. So I guess I got another question for staff counsel. I'm struggling with trying to figure out why we should endorse by not taking an action a situation that would change the status of the parties during the appeal process when we are not in a position of receiving evidence that changes the positions of the parties at this point. And there's not a record in front of us that I'm aware of that, at least on the memos that we've received so far, during the appeal process, that provides us some other evidence that we could rely on. So I don't know if you've got any thought on that.
Yeah, I agree. It's an emergency matter, and there are local calls involved. And despite the fact that the order that's on appeal doesn't address those, I think that you would be able to take into consideration the emergency nature of this, the fact that you actually don't have time or the information which would allow you to dot the I's and cross the T's, and you may want to schedule another hearing on this, or you may just want to issue a ruling that would allow things to go forward without the termination that Verizon implemented.
All right, anything else for staff? Mr. Wiley, I want to give you just a few minutes for brief response.
I'll be brief. There are a couple of things. First of all, in response to the trunks and how they are designated, we just order the trunks, both local and the Feature Group D, which originally were intended to handle IXC traffic, and then we assign what type of traffic they're for. We can't dictate what level 3 or Windstream, how they route their traffic, and I can't call them today and tell them to route it differently. I have no control over that. In many cases, it routes, it's very layered. So, Vonage, for example, hands their traffic to level 3, or now CenturyLink, who then in turn may hand their traffic to somebody else. This is a situation where that's not anything we can control. When you talk about local trunks and whether we have enough capacity and that we're using these other trunks for overflow, we can't do that. They're not allowed, like the way they're designed, that can't happen. And in reality, we have too much capacity for local. We are over the years, we've seen when it came to voice traffic, we've seen a drop in voice traffic altogether. And so we could easily probably work with Verizon and reduce the number of local trunks we have. There's no overflow issue that's causing local traffic to somehow flow through Feature Group D trunks and then now be rejected because Verizon has shut those off. I wanted to make that very clear because that situation that he's described is not reality. One of the questions that was raised was, is New Frontier somehow dragging out this process to avoid paying Verizon? And the case, at the onset of the case, it was established that we needed to file a letter of credit with Verizon and then money into escrow, and we continue to do that. So it's not as if there's some sort of avoidance of financial responsibility here. That's not the case at all. Just lastly, I will say this, that you do have jurisdiction over intrastate and local traffic. So intrastate is part of this, and that is also something you have jurisdiction over. And before you mentioned this, I'd written down that the Commission's primary function is to protect the ratepayers of Maryland. And honestly, they're the ones that are suffering the most right now. It's not just our customers, but it's people who are Verizon customers or somebody else's customers who can't reach them, and that's affecting more than just the few customers that we have. And so I think it's incumbent here that you consider that in your decision, that you do it. We ask that you order that these trunks are turned back on, and that we do this as hastily as possible, so that we can reestablish the status quo in this case, and then move forward through this process the way we were intended to do so, not under duress, because that's exactly what's happened here. This is Verizon's way of undermining the entire process and thumbing their nose at the commission in this case. And you have an opportunity now to put this back on track in the right way.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wiley. Any follow-up questions for Mr. Wiley? All right, if not, I want to thank all the parties for being here today. We're going to take this under advisement. We realize this is an emergency motion, so we will get an order out very shortly. So with that, we are adjourned.